Hi everyone, you're listening to the Blockchain Socials podcast, and for today's interview, I have Kelsie Nabben. She's a qualitative researcher on resilience in decentralized technologies and governance at RMIT in Australia, and she fairly recently published a really interesting article that she co-wrote with Michael Zargham called "Aligning the Concept of Decentralized Autonomous Organization to Precedents in Cybernetics." And I really enjoyed the paper, so I had to ask her to come on and so we can talk about it and talk about her research. So hi, Kelsie, how are you doing?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having me.
So I think maybe just to start, if you want, because I read a little bit into your background and I thought it was really interesting, and I thought you could just share maybe the story on like how you got interested in crypto systems, blockchains as a research topic, and like what got you in there. 'Cause as far as I understand, you worked in the blockchain industry a little bit for some time.
Yeah, that's right. So I actually started out working in government and I was interested, obviously, in theory and practice of governance and kind of societal coordination challenges and sort of structural change and all those kinds of things. I very quickly moved into the world of startups, seeing technology as a kind of scalable way to do some of those same things. And when someone, a colleague of mine, actually, to their credit, explained Bitcoin to me as a public blockchain, it was the idea of distributed consensus, as well as the broader social implications of these technologies that really caught my attention and got me interested. So I'd worked in impact technology, and it was kind of predicated on these the premise of, how can an idea and an enthusiastic founder create massively scalable global change, in agriculture or water tech or kind of any area. And in my view, crypto fell into that category. And so very rapidly, I went to work for one of the first ICO projects in Australia, and then was offered to move overseas and work for quite a well-known project at the time, where I really got to, dig quite deep into the public blockchain community, I guess.
And what was that experience like? Because I mean, I remember during the ICO time, it was pretty wild and pretty strange, at least from my point of view, from what I was perceiving.
It was like living in a novel. I honestly cannot explain it. Wandering around, sitting around with engineers and researchers and philosopher type characters, going to the houses of some of the early, inventors of like internet browsers for conferences like DWeb in San Francisco. I was just around people and in places I kind of never expected to have access to. So coming back to Australia and sort of shifting my perspective on the space to a research role has been a really nice way to reflect on not only some of my personal experiences in the space, but some of those broader themes and kind of aspirations and promises around, participatory systems and DAOs and all of these ideas.
Was it like after having all this, at least however many years you were working for this type of company, you decided I want to like slow down maybe a little bit and do some like thinking and research on the topic that they were maybe like working on?
Yeah, it was just time. I mean, classic kind of startup due to people and politics. The direction of the project wasn't going in its kind of original sort of way, or I guess as I had hoped. So I felt it was time to move on. And actually, as a non quote unquote technical person or as a non developer in the space, I found it quite hard to shift sideways in terms of moving roles. Like people often, want to pigeonhole generalists in the space to community management or business development or marketing. And those weren't areas I was so interested in. So when I got offered a scholarship to research, I took it up.
Okay, fair enough. Um, and then so a lot of your work has been about DAOs. But I was wondering, in like the work that you've done so far, is there anything that you sort of like noticed in particular about DAOs and those who are working on them through your ethnographic work? 'Cause I think, there are a lot of claims by DAOs, and, the word DAO even itself is like very difficult to define, and how people even think about the word decentralized and whether that's even a meaningful term in a lot of ways, in my opinion, or autonomous or whatever. Like they can vary wildly, I found, in how people like to do it. So I was just wondering, yeah, is there anything that you've noticed in your work that are like, I don't know, very, very interesting things that you've noticed?
Yes, is the answer to that question, and I guess where to begin. So I started my kind of venture into the concept and practice of DAOs by doing a little bit of historical research. And I kind of try and do open research. I find it's a really helpful way to process ideas and also get kind of feedback and engagement on my work from the community as well. So a lot of this work is kind of published as you go, and it's sort of available on my blog and whatever. But I started looking at, some of the origins of these concepts, kind of first mention from the first mention of the particular phrase, decentralized autonomous organization, in the field of cybernetics in this paper on a smart home system in a random little IEEE journal by a computer engineer called Werner Dilger. But then its appearance in blockchain communities came through forum posts by Dan Larimer, the founder of EOS and a number of other projects, talking about decentralized autonomous corporations. And then that gets responded to in a Bitcoin magazine post by Vitalik Buterin, and then the concept finds its way into the Ethereum white paper. And what really fascinated me at the time was this idea, as you rightly pointed out, of autonomy or an autonomous system. And it wasn't something at the time that I had read anything or seen anyone sort of thinking about or talking about. So I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole to try and understand what this concept meant and what it meant by the people that originally spoke about it. And there's that sort of quite well-known post from 2014 by Buterin on Dows, DAX, and more, and has these great quotes like, AI at the center and humans at the edges. And as a sociologist, I'm thinking, what does that mean? And where are we now in that projection, I guess, in terms of like, is automation synonymous with autonomy? What does AI on a blockchain mean? And I still think that's a really ripe area for further investigation, especially from a social science perspective. So that really caught my attention. And then I was fortunate enough to be quite involved in some of the big projects that transitioned to becoming a DAO, as I termed it, based on Nathan Schneider's work on exit to community. I called it exit to DAO. And so one major case study I've done for my thesis was on Gitcoin, and credit to, a number of their co-founders and core people involved in that process who allowed me to interview them in very busy times for them, or invited me to be involved in the fraud detection and defense working group and so on. But so many interesting dynamics that I think it really helps to reflect on alongside the community. And some of those, in the theory are called, the politics of infrastructure, and, how does this manifest in these decentralized organizations? And so in a more recent piece for a special collection on Web3, I talk about DAOs particularly, but Web3 more broadly, as kind of facing this challenge of how to infrastructure. And so building on the infrastructure scholarship of Susan Listar and Balka, it's kind of like people are all out here doing the thing and wanting to do DAOs, and it's still not a defined concept or a defined, technical or organizational framework. So we're kind of all trying to figure out like how to infrastructure, which is sort of how to, organize and govern, and what are the technical and social kind of institutions and processes and cultures and norms and artifacts that are part of that process.
Right. I imagine that because I don't know, I imagine DAOs being a particularly difficult thing to research because of its lack of like a formal structure. Like it's not easily identifiable that this thing is a DAO and this thing is just a name that put DAO at the end of, you know, the name of their of what is really like just their startup. Do you run into issues like that, or in your research have you come to any like thoughts or conclusion on what, I don't know, what are basic properties of a DAO or something like that? 'Cause I know a lot of people out there try to say like either it's just a multi-sig with a subreddit or something like that, or they say like, oh, it's way more than a multi-sig. It's, you know, it has to be really decentralized, and they say there has to be a token. And people say like, no, tokens don't really matter. You know, it's yeah. For me, that's why I've struggled a lot when I try to explain DAOs to anyone, because I want to give them like 10 different definitions.
So, my general working definition of DAOs is that they're a multi stakeholder community with a shared purpose. Now, that's obviously very general and could encompass a whole broad range of things, you know, any local community, whether it's digital or not. And obviously, it doesn't necessarily include this relation to blockchain. But I think there is something in coming back to that original use of the specific verbiage of the concept of a decentralized autonomous organization as this smart home system that I mentioned, and the idea that it's a, you know, fully enclosed, meaning autonomous from external direction or operation system, and that's kind of still encapsulated in what the blockchain concept of DAOs is trying to achieve. I should also point out that it's been really interesting for me doing research and work alongside lawyers. I mean, you talk about, you know, whether the idea of decentralization is helpful or not, but there's specific things that that means in a legal interpretation, and there's some really amazing people trying to advocate for, you know, legal personality, but not confining definitions, you know, in a corporate sense of what these things are, to provide that openness to experimentation and evolution in the actual practice, which has helped me navigate some of the definitional limitations, I guess, of the idea.
Okay, that's interesting, because so then you're using even a more general definition of a DAO, because I think what I think is really interesting that I noticed is that people were first started off with decentralized autonomous corporations, then they realized, oh no, corporations is too limiting. Organizations in general could do something like this. And then it moved to, you know, well, what exactly is the definition of a DAO? Does everything have to be automated? Which then changed to like, okay, actually, no, automation is not that helpful. Actually, we just use blockchain for very specific things, and actually, we're like a type of community that's just like tokenized or something like that. And then it's become as well like actually DAOs have existed for millennia before, and that you know, plenty of different types of organizations in human history can be considered DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, but it comes through like this lens of what you're saying, like it comes from a technological lens. It almost like it's like we've come full circle almost, which I think is very 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 funny but very interesting.
Yeah, I think partly I'm leaving my options open too. You know, like something you just mentioned around automation is a conversation I have all the time with the research team at Block Science, for example, around, you know, what is the role of automation in these systems, and what should be automated or what shouldn't be automated, and what is the relationship between humans and you know, automated components or algorithms or machine components in these systems. And I'm still, I guess, in active exploration of a lot of those ideas. So I don't want to confine myself to a definition that precludes, you know, potentially being able to positively influence or provide feedback on some of those ideas that, I mean, people talk about the Twitter sphere and the crypto echo chamber or whatever, but things very quickly become a zeitgeist, like the idea of governance minimization, and a whole lot of people started, tweeting that or putting that in their articles or whatever. But actually inspecting, minimization of what? Because if, this argument comes from Michael Zargham, but if you're introducing, algorithms into your system to remove governance, you're introducing more governance because someone has to determine the parameters of that algorithm. So actually you're talking about the reduction of human involvement, and to what degree or at what scale in your system, and all these things are very contextual, according to the community and the culture and the purpose of the system. So that's why I don't tend to abide to something that's too confining, as it is such an open area of kind of research and exploration still.
Nice. Yeah, I think we're getting now like into the territory of the article that I mentioned. So I thought it would be interesting uh, to begin like talking more explicitly about it, because I think you're using cybernetics as like let's say like a framework to understand DAOs, and it's a useful framework for understanding I think a lot of things. Um, and for me, I've become really really interested in cybernetics lately because I kind of found it as like a decent sort of generalized framework that can fit a lot of different things into it, which I mean can be problematic probably in certain contexts and in certain ways, but in other ways I think it's very interesting as a like cross-disciplinary framework to understand these types of phenomena. But before we get into that, I think it would be nice for people who don't know what cybernetics is, if you can provide me like a quick, a simple definition for it.
Yeah, sure. I can try. I mean, it's kind of amusing to me as I'm not a cybernetician or a computer engineer or anything. But I'm really excited and grateful for the opportunity to explore these concepts with you today, and share some of the research that I've been doing and some of the things that I've been learning. So, cybernetics, broadly, as you actually pointed out, is not so much of a discipline, but more a kind of intellectual aesthetic or tradition, which focuses on systems, meaning information systems and society. And so it emerged in the 1940s and kind of gained traction in some famous kind of meetup things in the 50s and 60s, where some kind of protagonists in that community emerged, names that you might know, especially kind of Stafford Beer, Margaret Mead, Heinz von Forster, Glanville, and others. And it kind of coincided with the invention of computing, but was this inherently interdisciplinary field drawing on mathematics and neuroscience and engineering, and of course my interest, anthropology. And so from this kind of intellectual tradition comes the modern day disciplines of information theory, control theory, AI, and a number of others, but they kind of branched out from those origins.
Yeah, and it's from what I understand, it's almost used kind of like a language for like basically people from different disciplines to be able to speak to each other, like because of its like the way that it abstracts to the system, to the level of systems as a general abstract concept that you can talk about like the similarities between the system inside your body and like the system within a society and the system within a computer, and that can be useful in a lot of different ways. And it's especially, I think, useful for, I mean, especially computers, I think, in relationship to humans. So now you can go like, you can have a framework for thinking between systems, or like things that are normally be like one particular domain versus another particular domain. But if there's like a very strong link between those systems, then you can sort of have like the same language to speak, so to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Multiple scales and relations between systems, which is obviously very relevant when it comes to DAO relationships or relations, and that as a nascent field of research in crypto communities. But also, as you mentioned, acknowledging organizations and society as complex systems in the same way that nature already demonstrates, or biology. And so there's this famous book by Stafford Beer called The Brain of the Firm, and he really studied the functions of the body and how the nervous system kind of connects the functions, and how the brain controls the nervous system, to try to come up with theoretical frameworks of how to organize organizations in the industrial era. And that's where this lovely framework called the viable system model comes from. And that's what we wrote about when we applied it to DAOs. And absolutely, credit where credit's due. I did not find that. That was a Zargham from Block Science Number, and then we got to work on it together.
I mean, just say because I studied neuroscience, so I think that's maybe partially why Stafford Beer, Brain of the Firm type of stuff really appeals to me, because I think I remember studying and being like, oh, there's similarities between this and greater society, but I would always keep that to myself because that'll be a weird thing to say. But then when I sort of learned about cybernetics, I was like, oh, other people have been thinking this too. I'm not a weirdo. And as well, just for maybe those who are maybe more on the left who are listening, that cybernetics was a really important field of study or discipline when it came to certain experimentations, especially in Chile, especially with Cybersyn, who Stafford Beer directly helped in build before it was destroyed after the coup.
Yeah, fascinating case study. There's really great little documentaries and stuff about that experiment, and a few papers reflecting on it as well. But yeah, how do you organize an entire economy according to the viable system model? And in the words of the triumphant, they did it, and it was highly effective.
Yeah, and what I like about it is that almost, at least in my opinion, it's kind of it's rather than taking sort of a overtly political view on the economy and how it should be run, it takes it as a taking it as a cybernetic, or think of it as a cybernetic system, sort of leads to very I would say conclusions that push towards something like socialism, in the sense that your system won't be very viable if if there's a huge power imbalance and there's major inequalities within your system, that then you have to provide in other things that sort of keep the system in place. But that's a whole complicated other conversation. I think it would be interesting maybe if we can talk a bit about what the viable systems model is and how does this stuff relate to DAOs?
Yeah, so just coming back to your previous point, I'll leave the politics to the blockchain socialist, but I think it's helpful to contextualize these ideas in the broad category of steering systems. And so that's what VSM and kind of broader cybernetics was all about. It was about governance as the direction of a system, and these in particular kind of this idea that systems should be autonomous, or as autonomous as possible, while still being viable, meaning functional. And the language used is kind of around the system being harmonious, or harmonious in line with the kind of shared purpose of that system. So how can those operational parts organize how they want, do what they want, be as, productive or effective as they can be, with kind of really clear rules about when, a different part of the system can intervene in their day-to-day operations if something isn't working, because there's sort of consent that autonomy can be violated in certain operational circumstances for the greater good, and that comes back to that kind of model based on how the body works. So the viable system model is really a framework for organizations. As I mentioned before, it was initially thought of in terms of factories in the industrial era. but has been sort of deeply applied in other areas, especially cooperatives. And there's a fellow by the name of John Walker that has a fantastic kind of handbook on VSM and co-ops, and a number of case studies where he was able to apply the model to cooperative organizational models as well, which is quite interesting in our case of Dows. And so, I mean, it's clear why this is a useful framework for thinking about DAOs, because it is about organizing autonomously. And I should point out, I guess, why cybernetics more broadly stood out to me, or I mean, I like that you spoke about how it registered for you coming from a neuroscience background. For me, it was this anthropological influence known as second order cybernetics. So, kind of the field is emerging and people are like, oh my gosh, let's think about, computational systems and all of these things. And then the anthropologists came in and said, hold on a second, you don't need first order cybernetics, you need second order, which considers humans in the loop, or looks, it acknowledges the role of the system designer as affecting and as part of the system. And I love that. And I think that's so relevant for blockchain, where there's that zeitgeist of, code is law and it's automated, equaling that it's autonomous and, it's objective in its governance and all these things. But if we're going back to these kind of origins of steering computational systems and trying to maximize autonomy and harmony in these systems, you have to acknowledge the role of the designer as part of those systems. And I think we're still on that journey as a blockchain community, and I'm really, really interested in that aspect of this kind of broad approach and application of the specific VSM framework.
Yeah, I think it sometimes seems that there's a danger in applying cybernetics in like a very narrow field, or like in a very narrow way of thinking. I think that just maybe stems from the fact that it came from a very, I guess, computer science maybe-ish place, or like where it's more commonly used in sort of like these highly technological systems as a way to understand very complex computing. But then I think there's this tendency to like forget that that there was a human that sort of built it in the first place. So there is this loss of like, I guess, meta understanding of the system itself, that you are part of that system. But I think there are, when applied appropriately with, I guess, second order cybernetics, in conjunction with a viable systems model where you're considering the humans as part of it, I think it's then easy to look, or I guess to consider the limitations of things like code is law or something like that, or that like, we need to, whatever like the blockchain sort of decides is what is reality, and we all need to stick by that. It sort of provides a way to look past that limitation, like look past the only technological side of things and sort of realize what is the role of humans in all of this, which is sort of like you said, in the zeitgeist of DAOs, is sort of like, I feel like a collective maturing is happening where people are realizing this.
Yeah, past the dogma. And I think, doing a startup is so consuming, let alone doing it in crypto land, where the volume of projects and people and activity is extremely fast paced. But I think that's largely what the role of, quote unquote, this lovely little cohort of crypto academics is becoming, is, this sort of arm's length perspective on the space, which is able to look a little bit more deeply at concepts like governance and help to, surface and synthesize and communicate what can be learned from, what is a long history in organizing society and, participatory systems and the politics of these things. So VSM is part of that, cooperatives that I mentioned is part of that. I've done work on data trusts, just looking at other, governance models and how they might be relevant, which I think is really important.
Hi everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. And if you're enjoying the interview or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at just $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons like Alchemist, Avinash, and Elise, which really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a special shout out on an episode like I just did and access to bonus content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this episode to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. Yeah, and speaking about cooperatives, I know that you fairly recently ran a course with the Platform Cooperatives Consortium that talked a lot about DAOs and platform co-ops. So to me, I think what is the cooperative world to a certain extent in the past, I think was probably I don't want to say the extreme, but it was mostly about human interaction and governance, whereas DAO world is sometimes purely the technological governance and interactions, or that tends to be a big focus. But I was wondering from your point of view, and maybe in what you covered in that course, what kind of overlaps with these two worlds do you see as being the most fruitful?
Yeah, I just want to say to your previous point, and you can cut this and paste it wherever you like, but there are clear limitations to cybernetics, as enthusiastic as I am about it as an approach for thinking about decentralized organization or organizing, doing word. So it is, as you correctly pointed out, it is still that engineering mindset and the idea that society can be engineered or perfected. So moving on from that, the question about co-ops is very relevant. So I got to present one session in a course run by Trevor Schultz from the New School, who's a leader in the Platform Cooperative Consortium community and has had a really open mind to explore the concept of DAOs and how it might relate to co-ops, what the DAO community could learn from co-ops, and kind of build bridges of shared literacy despite the kind of cryptocurrency skepticism from many, I guess, in the co-op community, and probably rightly so. And so that relationship actually started when I got to do a research sprint at the end of last year that was co-organized by Trevor. And myself, alongside a few peers, wrote a paper about DAOs and co-ops, which was a really interesting initial exploration. And I guess some of the arguments that we make in that working paper, which is publicly available, talks about interesting kind of areas of cross-pollination as the history of cooperative governance and participatory organizing is, one major area in terms of what can DAOs learn, as in what are the challenges of cooperatives? Well, they're going to be very similar to a lot of the challenges of DAOs. One of those in the co-op literature is about scalability. And so this is where DAOs potentially become interesting because they're organizing or governance at scale is still difficult, but there's this collective of kind of digitally native software development types and this active community doing software development, obviously, and these really interesting tools emerge. So you mentioned before, multi-signature wallets. I think things as simple as that have the chance to be potentially really revolutionary in other areas, such as co-ops, to enhance, transparency around fiscal management, for example, at scale or in distributed scenarios. Or I guess I'm thinking specifically about platform co-ops, which are kind of digital first cooperatives or businesses. So that's one. So thinking about tooling for scalability. And then another thing we point out is that cooperatives have these kind of democratic founding principles. So to be a co-op means to share these principles, and the co-op community is like really concerned about, it's called co-op washing, where just anything and everything claims to be a co-op. And we talked about that in relation to Dows. But I would encourage people interested in the idea of cooperatives or Dows calling themselves a co-op or whatever, to go and actually look through these 7 principles and think about how they are or aren't reflected in their own organization. And so part of that that we talk about in relation to DAOs, or what DAOs could potentially learn, is this idea of kind of constitutions of care. And so because cooperatives share these sort of guiding principles around democracy, and they're kind of clear about what that means in terms of like those that labor in the organization are those that, own and govern it. Well, that's not so readily reflected in DAOs, which might be more predicated on, plutocratic models or meritocratic models. And so what could that look like? And I know Nathan Schneider has done some work since on kind of, there was a Noema article about encoding human rights in blockchain systems. But I think that's still a very, very nascent area that could benefit from more great minds in terms of, thinking about digital organizations, but ones that kind of constitute positive social outcomes for those that participate.
Yeah, I recently spoke to Nathan Schneider and published the interview, and we talked about this piece, and he made some really interesting comments, or like theoretical musings that I thought were like, I had not thought about it before. I was surprised, but like having for example, a layer 2 blockchain that requires, in order to use it, like certain things to be met. So like having a certain level of decentralization, for example, or having certain things that encode human rights into that layer 2 blockchain as a way to start. I thought it was interesting because, and when you were talking about cooperatives, I think it could be interesting maybe to have like a co-op chain that is that sort of somehow enforces like the 7 principles or something like that of the ICA. I think would be really interesting. Perhaps difficult, but interesting.
Sure. But then what I enjoy is that you talk to like the mutualists. Like I've had some conversations with Sarah Horowitz, who's been a real kind of leader in that community, and so on. She spoke at one of the recent Protocol Labs events, and it was a really interesting conversation actually. But like one of her comments, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, was like, cooperatives are great, but they're very general. Like we need the mutualists, like, more, well-defined in terms of shared purpose and clearer in their mission for kind of solidarity. So, in the end, the point of blockchains, I guess, is that there's multiple ones. And while I don't think I subscribe to exit politics, because there's always a cost of exit and an entry and all of these things, which is a whole nother topic in and of itself. It's interesting to think about, well, how can you participate in the communities that, align with your values or politics, and what does it mean for those communities to relate to each other? But, choosing according to constitution is perhaps something that deserves sort of further inspection as well.
I'm curious where you lie in terms of like, are you optimistic that platform cooperatives will perhaps use some like tooling that is like more like you would think of for DAOs, and that would be beneficial, or that they could really gain from that?
Yeah, I think so. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in cooperatives by any stretch of the imagination. I try and like bring the DAO to the co-op people and do the bridge building in those communities or between those communities. But I think, if there's an inherent problem, as it says in the literature, around scalability, DAOs are addressing that in really interesting ways. And you introduced me as someone studying resilience, and I think that needs to be justified with somewhat of a definition. So I work off the basis of kind of a socio-technical understanding, which comes out of science and technology studies. It looks at systems in the broad sense of, things that are comprised of social and technical elements that interact and co-constitute one another. And so, resilience is about that adaptability and transformability and kind of threat or crisis. And so, the study that I do on decentralized technologies and DAO communities and with various projects, looks at the way that these communities, work through the technology to adapt and evolve and change or not. But some of those ways, employing, we've seen these ecosystems emerge of DAOs and sub-DAOs and, the kind of multi-level systems. And, that could be seen as, principles of subsidiarity, which comes from the commons literature, or polycentricity, so multiple centers of decision-making power. Another term I like for it, also out of the commons literature, is kind of this idea of like nested governance. And I am working on a piece with some colleagues at the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub, headed by Associate Professor Marta Poblet, on a concept called fractal governance. So kind of looking at how DAO ecosystems or DAO frameworks do or don't demonstrate properties of fractal networks in terms of recursion and self-similarity. We're doing some case study analysis. So the tooling is one part, but also the organizational models and how rapidly kind of innovation is occurring to adapt to changing circumstances, whether that be like tech fails or internal politics or wars between communities or whatever. It's really, really fascinating. And I think, what I'm trying to do is document those as qualitative experiences and surface the kind of insights that really it's the blockchain communities coming up with. I think there's interesting things there that others can learn from.
Yeah, just to mention the paper again, like what I really liked about it was this talk of resilience and adaptability, and just cybernetics as like a framework for thinking about adaptability and how a system adapts to its like changing environment. And yeah, one of the things that I think like co-ops will also have, dramas involved, just like DAOs do, and being able to withstand, I don't want to say threats, but could be threats, could be like many different things, but being able to adapt to that can be really useful in various different aspects.
Yeah, cybernetics has so many wonderful words and definitions. So that adaptability thing, it talks about, reachability and, how a system's governance should be, as flexible as is required to serve its kind of animating purpose, but no more flexible, because then you're introducing, more governance than you need. And we also talk about concept of robustness, as in like having really firmly set governance, which means it's not adaptive at all. But there's so many other wonderful words. I encourage people to look at wholeness, autopoiesis, which is this idea of a system capable of producing and maintaining itself by replicating its own parts, and a number of others. But yeah, very interesting and very useful.
I don't know. I feel I may be like too much on the pro cybernetics train, but I do think it would be a really interesting thing if everyone sort of had like at least an intro to cybernetics course, because I think it's a lot of concepts that are very, very useful for understanding like your place in a system and thinking about the systems in which you are relating to. And I know you don't want to talk about politics, but it's also I think something that can be useful for politics or thinking about political systems as well, or even like thinking about your little left-wing group in which you guys try to organize things together.
Well, VSM disambiguates the politics, and anyone listening to this should just Google VSM and look at the diagram of it, because you have the meta governance, which is, where the policy and everything occurs in System 5 and where the conflict resolution happens, and where the external environmental scanning and the internal scanning happens. And then you have the external environment, and we've talked about, resilience and threats, and they can be external or internal, obviously. And then you have the operations, which is those autonomous functions, which should be able to go about their business until they're not working anymore. And the internal scanning and that meta-governance is able to see that and pick it up and integrate it and reorganize resources and all these things.
I had one question on your work on IPFS as well, if you still have time.
Yeah, shoot.
So IPFS has obviously become a super important tool that a lot of different crypto applications use for decentralized file storage. And you recently wrote about the socio-technical resilience of IPFS as well. And I was wondering if you can talk a bit about that, because I sometimes hear people say that, for example, IPFS is not as resilient as you think, and that there are various shortcomings of it and things like that. And actually, maybe we don't want something that's so resilient with file storage, because people can, put different types of files of media that are, either illegal or, something that people wouldn't want to have on forever or something like that. But I was wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I should just say to your previous point, in terms of an introduction to cybernetics, it's a good place to give a shout out to Jessica Zartler, who's compiled a governance track for the Token Engineering Commons. I believe it's a free course, or maybe there's like scholarships, or it's low barrier to entry. And there's a bunch of resources, including some of the things that I've written and Zargham and others to think about governance. So I would encourage people to take a look at that. So IPFS has been an incredible infrastructure to study. I should point out that if for people not familiar, it is around content addressing data. So the way that the internet works is that things are location addressed. And so when something is no longer hosted at a location, you get a 404 error. Whereas when you content address something, you have a persistent hash of of that content, I guess. That's my kind of like layman's definition. I hope it holds up to any engineers listening to this. And also, I guess, shout out to IPFS, who actually, or Protocol Labs, who brought me on as their first social scientists in terms of research grantees. So they have a kind of fellowship program for researchers. And someone in the ecosystem was bold enough to help facilitate this research, where I got to interview a number of end users of the technology. And so what I was really interested in was their local context, their perception of resilience in terms of their kind of threat perception and what they were trying to be resilient against in their use of this tooling, and then their infrastructure, so how they actually set up their use of the network and what happened in practice. And so I got kind of purview of a range of case studies from people trying to do participatory blogs that were censorship resistant against nation state level threats. So this kind of very like active model of resilience to much more passive modes where people were trying to document Indigenous languages for lingual training apps. So it's really important data to address and store, but it's, maybe not someone trying to, actively hack or compromise that data, and a few things in between. So it was really, really interesting research, and I'm so grateful to the people that I got to kind of interview and observe in that. But I guess some of the high level takeaways of that were the relevance of resilience as a sociological concept. So we think about resilience, we think about kind of like cybersecurity and external threats, but really for people looking to manage their data, it was completely locally contextualized to their circumstances. And so what I found is people have all these bespoke infrastructures or kind of technical architectures and processes around how the data is addressed, where and how it is stored, and how it is kind of maintained or managed on an ongoing basis. And so I really saw, in some cases, the breakdown of resilience in those what I call gateway moments based in some of the literature and infrastructure studies. And so where people bridge from putting it on IPFS to storing it, if they're running their own servers across multiple geographic locations, and running kind of backup, periodic backup software, it is maybe quite resilient in their case, whereas others are hiring a server from a third party provider and kind of paying €20 a month or something out of their own pocket, which isn't necessarily resilient, or as the context of the data that they're collecting changes, isn't a sustainable kind of infrastructural setup. So really, it kind of, my research sort of emphasized how important the social dynamics of infrastructure are for the resilience of decentralized networks. And so from there, kind of my ongoing research focus areas are around, local first or bottom up kind of flexible governance models, and institutional infrastructure, which is kind of the, political, economic, and social contexts that surround, the operation and the maintenance of technical infrastructure. And also looking at, when should resources like data be localized, and when can they be abstracted. So it's really nice to think, we talked about scalability before, and, you have like Filecoin as this like globally scalable storage network. And, some of these things need to be professionalized. Like you want your storage provider to be well resourced and have expertise in fiber optic cables and whatever. But, your personal data about your local language should maybe be governed on some hard drives between local associations with a vested interest or a stake in that data persisting, to talk about, a definition of resilience. And so, it's an ongoing area of research, but I have a paper that's been peer reviewed and accepted in IEEE, and the working version of that is available online for people that are interested.
It seems to be like a consistent theme that there's sort of, we've created this technical infrastructure that is resilient in some way or another, and then there's always like a discovery that, oh, actually, like the human aspects of this are more important than we think, or maybe than we initially realized.
Yeah, I guess that's my contribution to the space as an ethnographer and a kind of qualitative methods person. But I really appreciate both. I think that's why I try and do as much work as I do with software engineers, as well as economists and lawyers and tax accountants and all these things, is because you want to look at, we're talking about societal systems, so you want to look at multiple sort of facets.
Nice. Yeah. And I really appreciate the work that you are doing. I think it's super important. And yeah, I think time will show that it is very important. So yeah, thanks a lot, Kelsie, for taking the time to come on and share your knowledge with us. Maybe just to finish it off, if you want to share with people where they can keep up with you and your work.
Absolutely. So I'm on Twitter for sort of some of the highlights as Kelsie, Kelsie, MVN, on academia.edu, and then just my full name. I try and keep a sort of digest of some of my publications. And then I'd sort of do that open source research thing across Substack, Medium, and more recently Mirror, which I think is really cool because you can kind of mint one-click NFTs, and then anyone that's interested in supporting or one person reached out, they were like, what's the actual point of buying an NFT of your post except supporting you? And I said, maybe I'll start a DAO, maybe I'll retroactively reward my supporters. Who knows? So there you go, bit of speculation.
All right, get ready for the airdrop of Kelsie coin.
Very, very, very lucrative.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.